The morning the desert stopped. Old Tucson, Arizona, March 1969. The desert did not wake gently. It never did. It announced itself with light, heat, and silence so heavy it felt alive. By the time the first production trucks rolled across the sand, the sky was already a pale, burning blue, and the air carried the sharp promise of another merciless day. Crew members stepped out with coffee cups in hand, squinting, shoulders already tense, knowing what this heat could do to a long shoot. The western town set stood waiting like a ghost of another century. False saloons, dusty boardwalks, crooked wooden doors that had seen more film legends than real cowboys. And in the center of it all, already in costume, already under the rising sun, stood Dean Martin. He had been there since 6:30 a.m. The wardrobe team had worked quietly around him, adjusting the worn vest, brushing desert dust from his boots, settling the weight of the gun belt at his waist. Makeup had dabbed away the sheen of early sweat. The wide-brimmed hat shadowed his eyes, but it could not hide them, alert, focused, and carrying a weariness that had nothing to do with sleep. Dean was 51 now. The years of stage lights, late nights, studio politics, and constant travel had carved something deeper into him than charm. He was still Dean Martin, the voice, the smile, the man people loved. But beneath it lived a craftsman who respected time, respected work, and respected the hundreds of invisible hands that made a film possible. He stood near the camera, script folded under one arm, running lines silently while the crew finished setting the shot. The director, Henry Hathaway, paced with the restless steps of a man pretending not to worry. Every 30 seconds he checked his watch. The assistant directors murmured. The grips leaned against equipment. Extras waited in the thin shade of canvas. Everyone knew what they were waiting for. John Wayne. Call time had been 7:00 a.m. By 7:20, the desert heat was already beginning to press against skin. By 7:30, it was undeniable. When the production phone rang, Hathaway snatched it up before the second ring finished. The voice on the other end was careful, practiced, apologetic in the way only someone delivering a familiar disappointment could be. "Mr. Wayne is running a bit behind. He'll be there by 8:30. Hathaway closed his eyes. 8:30 meant an hour and a half late, and that was only to arrive, not to be ready. When the call ended, he walked toward Dean, trying to soften something that had hardened long ago. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know you've been here since before sunrise." Dean shrugged lightly, but it was the shrug of a man keeping a door closed. "It's Duke," he said. "What are you gonna do?" Outwardly, the words were casual. Inwardly, something old and tired shifted. This was not new. Over 3 films together, Dean had watched this ritual repeat itself like a bad scene nobody dared rewrite. 15 minutes late, 40 minutes late, 2 hours late, always the same entrance, always the same easy grin, always the same expectation that the world would pause, that hundreds of people would stand idle under sun and pressure because one man had decided that time bent differently around him. And it always had. Because he was John Wayne. The name above the title, the myth in boots. The man studios protected, directors accommodated, and crews endured because jobs depended on him. Duke never yelled. He never abused anyone. He simply arrived when he wished, as if the clock were a suggestion rather than a promise. And every time, something small eroded, not anger, not hatred, but respect. At 8:45, nearly 2 hours after they were meant to be rolling, a long black car crunched across the sand toward the set. Conversation stilled. John Wayne stepped out wearing sunglasses, towering and unmistakable, holding a paper cup of coffee as if this were a relaxed morning stroll instead of a delayed production. He nodded to a few crew members, accepted a greeting, and ambled toward Hathaway. "Morning, Henry," he drawled. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "You're almost 2 hours late," Hathaway said. Wayne smiled faintly. "Am I lost track of time? I'll get into wardrobe." And he disappeared into his trailer. Another 30 minutes passed. The sun climbed, the costumes trapped heat, the crew shifted, waited, wiped their faces, said nothing. When Wayne finally emerged, ready for camera, he walked straight to Dean, clapped him on the shoulder, and smiled. "Ready to make some movie magic, partner?" Dean looked at him. "Been ready since 6:30. Wayne chuckled, missing the edge entirely. "That's why you're a pro, Dean, always prepared." They filmed. The scene was meant to be tense, 2 brothers meeting after years of silence. Dean delivered it with restraint and weight, grounding every word. Wayne was strong too when he focused, but between takes he drifted. He told stories, he wandered to craft services, he lingered. By noon they had shot barely a fraction of what they should have. The production was already bleeding hours. During lunch, Dean sat beneath a canopy, chewing without appetite, watching sweat darken the sand. A veteran character actor sat beside him. "You look like a man planning something dangerous," he said lightly. Dean didn't smile. "I'm thinking about Duke." Dean nodded. The man exhaled through his nose. "Nobody fixes Duke. He's been this way 30 years. "Maybe that's the problem," Dean said quietly. The afternoon improved only slightly. When rap was finally called, Hathaway approached him again, voice low. "I know it's frustrating, but we work around him. That's the reality." Dean looked out toward the set, where lights were being powered down, where grips carried gear heavier than most people's patience. "What if we did?" he asked. Hathaway blinked. "What if tomorrow?" Dean continued evenly. "We don't wait." The director let out a short laugh. "We can't shoot without John Wayne." "Then let's shoot what we can. Let's show him something." Hathaway studied him. Dean leaned closer. "Tell him call time is 7, but bring the crew at 5:30. We start at 6. We work. We film. When he arrives, I want him to see a set that didn't stop breathing just because he wasn't here." Hathaway hesitated. "That's a fight," he said. "No," Dean replied. "It's a mirror." Silence stretched. Then slowly, Hathaway nodded. That night, while the desert cooled and Tucson's lights flickered on, phones rang quietly. Crew members were informed. Schedules shifted. A plan took shape. And in a hotel room miles away, Dean Martin lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering whether he was about to fix something or fracture it forever. Because the next morning, the desert would wake again. And this time it would not wait. The set that refused to sleep. The desert before sunrise was a different world entirely, stripped of its cruelty and painted instead in soft indigo and silver. A thin cold hung in the air, enough to raise goosebumps on the arms of men who knew by noon it would be unbearable. Production trucks rolled in with muted engines. Boots crunched quietly against gravel. Floodlights blinked on one by one, washing the empty western street in pale white. It was 5:30 a.m., and old Tucson was alive in a way it had not been the day before. Crew members moved with an unusual sense of purpose, as if participating in something unspoken yet collectively understood. This was not simply another early call. This was an experiment in dignity. Dean Martin arrived at 5:45. He stepped out of his car and paused, surprised by what he saw. Equipment was already being positioned. The camera crew was setting angles. The makeup trailer was open. Coffee steamed in paper cups. There was energy here, not the tired waiting of the previous morning, but the hum of people who felt respected enough to be used. Dean walked toward wardrobe as dawn crept across the horizon, feeling something unfamiliar in his chest. Hope, maybe. Or resolve finally given motion. By 6:10, he was in full costume again. By 6:15, he stood on mark beneath rising light while the first scene of the day was framed. It was a solo moment from later in the script, one usually shot mid-production, but today it became the opening. His character stood outside a small wooden house, reflecting on the past, the camera meant to read memory from his eyes. The desert was silent except for wind through scrub. Hathaway raised his hand. Action. Dean did not act as if this were revenge. He acted as if it were truth. The words were spoken softly, but something heavy moved beneath them, a sense of men carrying years they never learned to put down. When Hathaway called cut, the crew did not cheer. They simply moved quickly, cleanly, efficiently, resetting without hesitation. It was the smoothness of a machine finally allowed to run. They went straight into the next scene, then another, then another. Conversation between takes was short, purposeful. There was laughter, yes, but it didn't stretch. There were no wandering stories, no idle waiting. The camera rolled. The sun climbed. The desert began its daily transformation, and still they worked. At 7:30, the phone rang. "Mr. Wayne is running a bit behind," the assistant said. "He'll be there by 8:30. Hathaway didn't even look up from the monitor. "That's fine," he replied. "We're shooting." By the time 8:00 arrived, they had completed 3 full scenes. The crew, who had spent years organizing their days around absence, found themselves energized by presence. There was a strange, almost rebellious satisfaction in it, not defiance, but relief. Relief that their time mattered today. At 8:45, John Wayne's car pulled up. The sound of tires on gravel cut through the desert air and something shifted instantly. Wayne stepped out as he always did, tall, unhurried, sunglasses on, coffee in hand. But the scene before him did not match the one he expected. The set was not waiting. The set was alive, lights were blazing, the camera was rolling. Dean stood in the middle of a take, voice low and steady. Crew members moved between equipment with practiced urgency. This was not a paused world, this was a working one. Wayne stood still. For the first time in decades, he was not the beginning of the day. He was interrupting it. He walked toward Hathaway, confusion tightening his expression. "Why are you filming?" "Because it's 8:45, Hathaway replied without turning away from the screen. "And we started at 6. Wayne frowned. 6. "We've already completed 6 scenes. Wayne's jaw shifted. "Without me." "Without you," Hathaway said evenly. "We worked around your absence." Wayne looked across the set. He saw the slate clap, the camera repositioning, the sweat on foreheads that had been earned, not waded into. His world did not bend, it moved. "This was Dean's idea," he said. Dean stepped forward. "It was everyone's need." The words did not carry anger, they carried gravity. "You've been late on every film we've done," Dean continued. "And nobody has ever made it matter, but it does matter. It costs hours, it drains people, it tells them their time doesn't count. Today we decided to stop saying that." Wayne's voice hardened. "I'm the star of this picture." "You're a star in it," Dean replied calmly, "not the production itself." Something in the air grew dense. Crew members busied themselves too deliberately. No one wanted to be seen listening. Everyone was. "You've got nerve," Wayne said. "Somebody had to," Dean answered. "Respect isn't silence, it's honesty." Wayne stared at him, then turned and walked back to his trailer without another word. 10 minutes passed. They were the longest 10 minutes anyone could remember. Every sound seemed louder, every movement heavier. No one knew if the next thing would be a phone call to the studio, a public argument, or a production shutdown that would echo across Hollywood. Then the trailer door opened. Wayne emerged in full costume. He walked straight toward the set. "What's my first scene?" Hathaway blinked. "Scene 42. "Let's shoot it." The confrontation scene. They took their marks inside the saloon. The set was dim, shafts of sunlight cutting through dusty windows. The tension between the characters was scripted, but the tension between the men was real, alive, sharp. Hathaway called action. Wayne delivered his lines differently today, less casual, more present. Dean answered him with equal weight. They weren't performing distance. They were standing inside it. When cut was called, nobody spoke. Hathaway simply said, quietly, "That's the one." They worked the rest of the day without interruption. Wayne did not wander. He did not linger. He watched playback. He listened to notes. He stayed. And when rap was finally called, he asked Dean to walk with him. They stepped away from the lights into desert scrub, where the world was quiet again. "I didn't like what you did this morning," Wayne said, "but I needed it." Dean waited. "I've been late because I could be," Wayne continued. "Not because I should. I forgot what it costs. I forgot who it lands on." He exhaled. "You showed me I'm not the center, and I should have remembered that a long time ago." Dean met his eyes. Legends still work with people. Wayne nodded. "I'll be here tomorrow before call." And for the first time since this began, Dean believed him. The morning the legend arrived first. The next morning, the desert had not yet decided whether it belonged to night or day. A pale blue mist clung to the horizon, and the air was cool enough to sting the lungs with every breath. Floodlights glowed like distant moons across the empty western street. Crew trucks idled softly. Equipment was being unloaded. The world felt suspended, waiting to be told what kind of day it would become. Dean Martin arrived at 6:25 a.m., earlier than usual, not out of obligation but out of uncertainty. The previous day had cracked something open. He did not know if it would heal or shatter. He shut his car door, adjusted his jacket, and then stopped. John Wayne was already there. Not in a trailer, not wandering. He was standing near the coffee station in full costume, Western hat resting back on his head, talking quietly with a lighting technician while steam rose from a paper cup in his hand. He had been there long enough for the crew to treat his presence as normal. He had been there long enough for it to matter. Dean watched him for a moment without approaching. There was no announcement, No grand gesture, just a man who had decided to be where he said he would be. Wayne noticed him and lifted his cup slightly. "Morning, partner, you're late." It was said lightly, but it was not a joke. Dean glanced at his watch. "By 5 minutes." Wayne smiled. "I'll try not to hold it against you." They stood there for a moment, two legends in borrowed dust, surrounded by people who suddenly felt something new: predictability. And predictability in this business was respect. They began shooting at 6:30 on the dot. No waiting, no searching, no empty minutes. The camera rolled into the first scene of the day with a momentum that surprised even the assistant directors. Wayne was sharper. He listened between takes. He asked questions about framing and pacing. He stayed in position while the crew adjusted lights instead of walking off. He watched playback. He nodded. He corrected himself. He was not trying to perform professionalism. He was practicing it. By 10 a.m., they had completed more work than they had on any morning of the shoot. The crew noticed. So did the production office. So did the studio when daily reports came in showing progress that had not been expected. But most of all, Wayne noticed. He noticed the absence of tension, the absence of murmured frustration, the absence of wasted heat. During a break, he sat on a crate instead of retreating to his trailer. A young grip handed him a bottle of water. Wayne thanked him by name. He asked where he was from. He listened to the answer. It was a small thing, but small things are where habits live. That afternoon, while waiting for a set reset, Wayne walked over to Dean. "I thought being late made me powerful," he said quietly. "Made me untouchable. But standing here early this morning, watching everything move without scrambling, without resentment, without waiting on me, it felt better." Dean nodded, because power that costs people something always comes due. Wayne looked at him for a long moment. "You risked a lot." "So did you," Dean replied. The days that followed confirmed it was not an act. Wayne arrived before call every morning, sometimes 6:20, sometimes 6:10. Once, when a truck had broken down overnight and the set was delayed, he stayed with the crew, helping move equipment, refusing to retreat. He learned names. He remembered them. He stopped stretching breaks. He stopped being absent inside presence. And something else happened alongside the schedule change. The work deepened. The scenes between Dean and Wayne gained weight. Their fictional brotherhood took on an authenticity no amount of rehearsal could manufacture. The tension they had confronted off camera had burned away performance. What remained was honesty. Their arguments on screen carried real restraint. Their reconciliations carried real relief. Hathaway noticed it first in playback, then the editors, then everyone. One evening, after a long day that still ended on schedule, Wayne asked Dean to walk with him again, farther this time, beyond the lights, where the desert stretched unbroken. "I've spent most of my life with people adjusting to me," Wayne said. "Changing schedules, rewriting scenes, waiting. I let that become normal." Dean listened. "You showed me something I hadn't seen in years," Wayne continued. "A set that didn't need me to breathe, people who could work without me, and instead of making me smaller, it made me want to deserve being there." Dean said quietly, "That's the difference between being important and being responsible." Wayne smiled faintly. "I'm trying to learn the second one." They stood in silence for a while, watching the sun sink into the sand. The production stayed on schedule, then it crept ahead of it. What had begun as a confrontation became a recalibration. Crew morale shifted. Days felt shorter. The heat felt lighter. There was less rushing because there was less waiting. The studio executives visited once, expecting to manage delays, and instead found a set that was calm, efficient, and unusually united. On the final week of shooting, Wayne arrived one morning carrying a small velvet box. He handed it to Dean without ceremony. "Open it." Inside lay a silver pocket watch. Heavy, simple, the back was engraved. "Time is the one thing we don't get back." Wayne watched his reaction. "I carried a watch like this when I was young, before the name, before the excuses. I stopped wearing it when time stopped meaning something. I wanted you to have this one because you made it mean something again." Dean closed the lid slowly. He did not speak for a moment. "You didn't just change my call time," Wayne said. "You changed how I walk onto a set, how I see the people there, how I see myself there." Dean finally looked up. Then it was worth the risk. They finished the film without delays, without overtime overruns, without the exhaustion that usually follows Western shoots. On the last day, Wayne arrived first again. He stood beside the crew as equipment was dismantled, thanking people individually, shaking hands that had spent weeks lifting the weight of his name. And the desert, which had watched the whole transformation, received them that final evening in quiet gold. But the real legacy of what happened there would not live in the film. It would live in what followed. Because John Wayne did not leave Arizona unchanged. And the next time he stepped onto a set, the clock would not be waiting for him. The time that remained. When the final scene wrapped and the last light was powered down, the desert returned to its ancient stillness as if nothing extraordinary had happened there at all. The false buildings stood empty. The dust settled. The road erased the tracks of production trucks within hours. But something real had been built in that heat, something that would not pack into crates or travel back to Hollywood. What had changed in Arizona traveled instead inside people. It traveled in habits, in mornings. In how one of the biggest names in American cinema would now step into every room he entered. On John Wayne's very next film, the call sheet listed a 6:30 a.m. start. The crew expected what they had always expected. They prepared themselves to wait. But at 6:05, a familiar tall silhouette appeared at the edge of the set. No announcement, no entourage, just John Wayne in work clothes, coffee in hand, greeting grips who were still unloading equipment. When the assistant director noticed and checked his watch twice to confirm it, he stood frozen for several seconds before walking over. "Mr. Wayne, we're not ready yet," Wayne smiled. "That's all right, I am." Word spread quietly across the lot. By the time cameras rolled, something unspoken had already taken root. People were not adjusting to him. He was adjusting to the work. The change did not fade, it deepened. Wayne began asking for schedules in advance. He reviewed scenes the night before. He stopped drifting between takes. He sat beside camera. He thanked people by name. He listened when crew members spoke. He corrected himself when he slipped. And when reporters noticed and asked about it, he did not craft a story that made him look heroic. He told the truth. He spoke about Arizona, about Dean Martin, about being late, about being wrong. About being lucky that someone had cared enough to confront him before the habit calcified into character. "Dean Martin did me a favor," he said in one interview. "He reminded me I wasn't bigger than the work, and nobody's bigger than the work." The story moved the way Hollywood stories always do, not in headlines, but in hallways. Grips told grips. Makeup artists told assistants. Directors told other directors over late dinners. A legend had been challenged. A legend had listened. A legend had changed. Younger actors, hearing it, found courage in it. Some spoke up for the first time on sets where behavior had long gone unquestioned. Some directors tightened schedules and enforced them. Some stars arrived earlier than required. Respect became contagious in small, nearly invisible ways. Dean Martin never tried to own the story. He never repeated it in public. When asked, he deflected. He joked. He said Duke was a good man who had made a good decision, but he carried the watch. He carried it on other sets, in dressing rooms, on airplanes. Sometimes he would take it out before a scene and turn it in his palm, not because he needed the time, but because he wanted the reminder. That accountability, when offered with respect, was not cruelty. That silence was easier, but truth was kinder. That the courage to disrupt could sometimes create the peace people thought they were preserving. Years passed. Films were made, some succeeded, some faded, new names rose, old names dimmed, but Wayne remained changed. Crew members who worked with him after Arizona spoke of a man who showed up before the sun and stayed until the work was done. A man who asked where people were from. A man who listened. A man who had learned late in life that presence was its own kind of power. In the spring of 1979, Dean received a call that did not need many words. Wayne was dying. He was weak. He wanted to see him. Dean drove to Newport Beach and found the house quiet, curtains drawn, the ocean audible in the distance. Wayne lay in bed thinner than the screen had ever allowed him to be, but his eyes were still sharp. They spoke for hours, about films, about women, about mistakes they would not name publicly, about how strange it felt to reach an age where memory outweighed plans. At one point, Wayne gestured weakly toward Dean's jacket pocket. "You still carrying it?" Dean took out the watch and placed it in his hand. Wayne closed his fingers around it. "That morning in Arizona," he said slowly, "I was embarrassed, angry, scared, not because you made me late, because you made me equal, and I needed that more than I knew." Dean said nothing. "Most people," Wayne continued, "they don't tell you the truth when you get big. They protect their comfort. You didn't. You risked ours. That's what made it real." They sat in silence. 3 months later, John Wayne was gone. At his funeral, Dean stood before a room filled with faces that had defined an era. He spoke about Duke's strength, his humor, his discipline. And then he spoke about Arizona, about a man who had been late, about a conversation nobody else wanted to have, about a legend who had listened. Respect, Dean said, is not applause, it's accountability, and Duke gave me the honor of accepting it. Afterward, Wayne's widow sent Dean a small package. Inside was the watch and a letter. It spoke of time, of gratitude, of mornings that had been reclaimed, of regret that had softened into learning. It thanked Dean not for friendship, but for courage, for being willing to disturb comfort in order to protect character. Dean placed the watch back in his pocket. He carried it until his own final years, and when he was gone, his children found it among his belongings. They read the letter. They understood something no headline could explain. Their father had not only entertained millions, he had changed one man, and that one man had changed rooms, and those rooms had changed cultures, and cultures slowly, invisibly shaped the world. John Wayne showed up late on a set. Dean Martin's response shocked everyone. Not because it was revenge, but because it was respect. And respect, when it finally speaks, has a way of lasting longer than legends.